Time for our next speaker, Steve Hanon, Senior Hanon, whom I have known for 8 years now, and he is the person who infected me with the MAP virus 4 years ago, and I'm very grateful for that. Steve grew up in St. Louis, went to Purdue, and remains a loyal Boilermaker. He went to business school at WashU in St. Louis and has worked at Macy's, PepsiCo, and Limited. He lived in Spain for several years. And for the past, I believe, 10 years, maybe more, he's worked for Avenues The World School. He's president of the New York Map Society, married to Lynn and father of Alex and Rachel. Steve is a man, he's going to get embarrassed here. Sorry, Steve. A man of many adjectives. He is smart and fun and funny and honest and adventurous and intuitive and strategic. And after a drink or two or in private conversation can employ language that is slightly salty. He is encyclopedic in his knowledge of maps and history, someone I thoroughly enjoy hanging out with, having a far-ranging conversations, and I'm honored to say a friend. Steve Hanon.
Thank you, Tom. I'm going to share my screen. Give me 1 second here.
Maybe you should mute us.
Yeah, we will start muting people.
All right, are you all seeing my screen?
Yes.
So,
Yes.
Well, look, Tom, thank you for the introduction. And I would say that having to follow the two previous speakers, there's a thing in experience design called the peak end effect, where you tend to remember the things that are the peak and highlight of an experience in the end. And unfortunately, I'm at the end. So, so next time I'll make sure I fall somewhere in the middle so I don't have to have such high expectations. But I thought the two previous speakers had really tremendous presentations. And of course, I've known Daniel for many years and always enjoy listening to him. So that was great. So just before I get into sort of why Spain, and as Tom alluded to in the introduction, I have a connection with Spain that goes back many years now. From high school, I stayed with a family in Cordoba in southern Spain, Andalusia. I went to University of Madrid at the Complutense for a year during my junior year abroad in college, moved to Spain in 92 to 94 and a half, working as a strategic consultant for Price Waterhouse, where I worked with a variety of clients in Spain and across Spain. I got to learn about the country and its people much better. And then joined PepsiCo in strategic planning and international operations, where we had a pretty big presence in Madrid, and I had an apartment there, would go back and forth between Madrid. So I've spent about 5 or 6 years cumulatively in Spain, and I love the country. And it's been one of the reasons I've gotten into kind of cartography. I think my first map was an Ortelius Typus Orbis Terrarum. The second was the map of Sevilla, the Braun and Hogenberg, because I just love that city. I spent some time there doing work with the port of Seville, where all of the gold would flow in and out. I think that in part inspires sort of my interest in the age of discovery. So with that, I want to start with kind of a timeline that frames the age of discovery in the 15th and 16th centuries. And a lot was going on in particular towards the very end of the 15th century. And I started with Gutenberg inventing the printing press. My first job out of college, I sold financial printing and worked for R.R. Donnelley and Sons Company. So, and in that job, we learned how the printing press worked and how engraving and rotogravure and reverse imagery, all of those things are employed in the printing process for maps and books. And so, so as part of my connection with maps, it's the printed material, it's the art, it's the travel, it's connecting the story of the map with the place. And so for me, it kind of brings together a number of things, as well as family heritage and where we may have lived. And so seminal events after the Gutenberg press are really, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabel of Castile. They marry, uniting a diverse kingdoms in Iberia under the Catholic rule, known as the Los Reyes Católicos. And Columbus actually, few years earlier, washes up on the beaches in Portugal after having suffered a shipwreck. He lived in Lisbon for a while, but he makes his way to Spain in 1485, starting to plant the seed of his travels to the New World. And in 1492, a lot was happening in Spain that day. And I just have to give a little point here that, I mean, a lot of what happened there was really bad, and a lot that came out of that was really bad. And so I sort of say this with some reservation. I was talking to Thomas, and I have some difficulty in the current environment talking about some of this stuff because, the whole idea of Columbus and discovery and colonization has, it has what it has. It has sort of a current bad view. But I just present this from the standpoint of factual history and don't make any kind of support. But I just wanted to say that it's, we acknowledge that there's some bad actors here, but we'll talk about them a bit. On January 2nd, Abu Abdullah Muhammad the 11th, the Nasrid ruler of Granada, surrenders the Alhambra to the Catholic kings. My father's surname, his mother's surname was Nasser. I'm about a quarter of my heritage is Syrian, so I kind of feel like I got kicked out of Spain at the same time. In March, the kings expelled the Jews, and it either forced them to leave or convert to Catholicism, which creates a whole class of what they call conversos in Spain. And a lot of people fled, some people stayed, and they did the conversion. And then in sort of May and July, Columbus begins to outfit his small fleet on the coast of Spain, getting ready to set sail in September. And as we all know, on October 12th, lands in America, thinking he's reached the Far East, which we know he has not. A couple of other voyages occur. And then I'm running down here, and then in 1499 to 1502, important to note that Amerigo Vespucci, who was also a companion on some of the vessels, explores the coast of America, discovers the mouth of the Amazon in modern day Brazil, and essentially is credited for the discovery of America on Waldesmuller and a Gutierrez map that we're going to see in a moment. Just pushing forward, I just highlight Charles V ascends to the throne in 1516, which is now the Habsburg Spain, an empire where the sun never sets. You'll see that in a second. And then Magellan begins his circumnavigation in 1519, winters in Patagonia, makes his way to the Philippines, dies in a skirmish with indigenous forces, and ultimately Del Cano, one of the surviving shipmates, if you will, returns to Sevilla via Cape of Good Hope with only 20 survivors. So, that was sort of the seminal moment of the circumnavigation. And of course, in 1520-21, Cortez sacks Tenochtitlan, current day Mexico City. I will note and give a plug, the current Califia does have a great little article about maps of Tenochtitlan that David Califan had prepared. So I encourage you to look at that. And so from here, I'll move on to the next slide. Again, this just referencing earlier the Habsburg Spain. While they controlled a lot of the New World, they had great influence within Europe. You can see now modern day Spain at the time, they had holdings into the sort of Austrian, and the Habsburg family had some roots in Austria and also the Netherlands and all the colonies in southern Italy, Naples, Sicily, and Sardinia. So pretty big footprint and influence over Europe. This is a map, a Vassavore map of Spain in 1532. If I can, I don't know if I can make it any bigger, but a little bigger maybe. It's just a beautiful map. It's the first printed map of Vassavore, or stamped map by Vassavore. And you'll see on here, it's pretty simple. The principal cities of Toledo, Sevilla, Córdoba, Madrid. A theme you'll hear in my talk today is Madrid is super small. You can barely see it. Madrid is the capital of Spain today. It wasn't a particularly important city in the day. These other cities, Sevilla or Hispales, were very important. Toledo, you'll see Valladolid, and you'll be hearing about a city called Alcalá de Henares, which really is a much more important city than Madrid in the time. So just keep an eye out for that. Let me come to the next slide. Similarly, older map, 1545. This is the Sebastian Munster map of Spain. And again, it wasn't really Spain. I would call it Iberia at this time. Spain was still kind of, very much in, the local fiefdoms or, kind of regions, Castilla and Aragon and Catalonia. So there's very little detail on this, but this is one of the earlier maps you can find of Spain. Kind of comes out of the Ptolemaic design mindset. And moving on, you think about the Columbus journeys. This is a portolan chart that was made by Juan de la Cosa. This is currently sitting in the Museo Naval in Madrid. Tom, I know, has visited the Museo Naval, as have I, and he brought me back about 5 years ago, I want to say, a poster of this adhered to a press board. So I have it in my office somewhere, and I really enjoy it. But this map is really pretty typical of the portolan maps. We can see you've got, I'll show you in the next page, but like the coastline of the Mediterranean is pretty well detailed, with cities of higher importance indicated in red. Always sort of the images of kings, or the three kings here, and the birth of Christ, the mother and Madonna and baby. This figure up here is Saint Christopher, who's a patron saint of travelers. I think appropriate for this map, which is a traveler's map. There's some other interesting curiosities on the map we can look at here. Again, this would be like the Spanish coast, pretty well. I mean, these portolan charts, you get, there's a whole arm of study around them, but you can actually see how they were used heavily in the Mediterranean, and they have all the place names, and people actually use these, and they actually navigated with some of them. There are some others that are just beautiful maps that were for display. Daniel, I remember a couple of years ago, we had the chance to see the Maggiolo map, which is a large world portolan map but that was never intended to travel on a ship. It was really meant to be a landmark piece for a very wealthy family to display in their castle or their home. You see here little images of Hispaniola, where Columbus had landed. Again, the Madonna and child I referenced earlier in the sort of compass rose. Typically, this would be at the top of the map, but in this particular map, they put the Saint Christopher at the top for the traveler. And then you see some mythical creatures here, God and Magog, which I think from Old Testament sort of myths were represented over in the Middle East and in Jerusalem area. This was interesting. I was thinking about this. I was looking at a book called The Empire's Rivers of Gold, and they had a chart in there that were actually a table that showed the number of outgoing and returning vessels over a period of time. And when you look at it, what's interesting is about of the 618 ships who left the Spanish ports sailing for the Indies, only 450 returns. That's a loss factor of about 27% of all vessels. Either I presume they were lost at sea because they probably just didn't stay there. But it sort of points out the perils of traveling in those days. And while there's so much unknown, and the small ships they were sailing, and the weather and lack of navigation and inability to understand and determine longitude, it's understandable how you could lose 27% of your ships. That doesn't happen today, though. I actually pasted this image in after our first speaker today because I was jealous he had better data visualizations than I did. And this is, you may have seen, there's a number of sites that have, this is from marinetraffic.com. There's a number of sites that are very, very interesting that have real-time data flows of containerized cargo or all vessels on the ocean at any point in time. You can drill down and understand which vessel that is. And for me, just a little side story, when I was working in Spain as a strategy consultant, one of my clients was the port of Madrid, the port of Sevilla, and also the port of Algeciras, which is right at the tip of Gibraltar. And it's a major transshipment hub for containerized cargo through and back into the Mediterranean and West Africa. And so it's sort of like it's a cargo terminal where ships stop and they unload and they redistribute. But I spent a bunch of time up in Sevilla, and it made me think about when you study ports and shipping, you start to see commerce visually as images of ships or containers moving through the various ports or through the various canals. So like as the earlier speaker talked about, that large container vessel being stuck in the Suez Canal, I'm like, yeah, I mean, I can just see that. And so this is a pretty interesting visualization of ships, and it's kind of nice how it goes through Spain. The Straits of Gibraltar there historically were called the Gates of Hercules, or Pillars of Hercules. And I just thought I'd add that in because it added to the whole idea of like the maritime traffic. This is a very famous map, but it's not a study as much as it probably should be. It's from the Library of Commerce. There's only two existing copies of this map, one in the Library of Congress. I think the other probably maybe in the British Library. I'm not sure if it's the British, but this was a map by Gutierrez, who's a Spanish cartographer. You'll also notice that there aren't so many Spanish cartographers who actually have their name on the map. In the day, all of the trade and secrets and routes that Spain had established with the New World were kept as like trade secrets and top secret, and they were in the Casa de la Contratación in Sevilla. And so they just didn't get out, they didn't publish. And this is one that was published in 1562, leveraging what was meant to be sort of the body of knowledge that Spain had accumulated from various voyages to the New World. And in that regard, it's a pretty complete view of the Americas, and one of the first of the printed maps to have that's a Spanish printed map to have the name America on it. Most of the earlier maps you see we had New Spain would be the description of the lands in the New World. So, and I'll do some zoom ins on the next pages here. You can see here that the English translation is a new and accurate description of America, also known as the fourth part of the world. Daniel has on his website I've been eyeing a map by Isidore of Seville, which is the first printed map in a book that shows the three parts of the world, Europe, Africa, and Asia, I think. So this is the fourth part. And this shows King Charles V riding his chariot to the New World, which is kind of an interesting thing with this, poking at maybe Poseidon with his trident sword. The map has the Amazon River correctly identified. This also is when you think through the Vespucci story, he kind of sailed the coast and actually did, in fact, find the headwaters of the Amazon, where it where actually maybe not the headwaters, where it kind of came into where it outflowed. You see mythical, sort of sea creatures and mermaids and Patagonian giants, and of course, Brazil in the day was often you find scenes of cannibalism or things of that sort on a lot of the maps, whether they were either Spanish or Portuguese, but that was pretty common, if you will, thing that's portrayed. This map also is one of the first to have the name California appear on the map. So for you California Map Society people, I thought you might enjoy that, to the tip of Baja. And so I've got that sort of indicated there. And as I said earlier, I think in the earlier comments that, this attributes the America to Amerigo Vespucci, despite, growing up, we all thought it was Christopher Columbus. Now, this was a map from 1605. It's a Blau map of Spain. I chose this map because, it's beautiful, and it's, it has you start to see Spain kind of as a, kind of a country more than just the regions that some of the earlier simplified maps have. With the beginning of a couple cities, you see Toledo, Valladolid, Lisbon, and Sevilla. No mention of Madrid, obviously, because it wasn't that important back then, and didn't become the capital until sometime later in the century. But this is a pretty typical style of a Blau map, beautiful cartouches. To me, one of the things about the maps I love is sort of maps as art, and maps of the development of the country or cities are, to me, very interesting. Another map here is a Hondius map about 10 years later. This I referenced in my article about the Don Quixote map. This was published right in the middle of, or right between the publication of the first and second editions or the first and second part of the Quixote in 1610. The Quixote was initially published in 1605 and 1615, so it's sort of right in the middle of that. So this would have contemporary views of Spanish dress. You can see different people from different regions. Again, the cities Lisbon, Toledo, Sevilla, Valladolid. I can't see what is there. Malaga on the coast, Burgos, Bilbao, Granada, Alhambra, which would be in the Alhambra in Granada. But again, no mention of Madrid on here, which is sort of interesting for those who are not very familiar with Spain. So again, another first of its kind with the Carta Figures map of the people in dress. And you think about in the day when people can travel, this along with Braun and Hogenberg's Civitatis would be the way people would learn about the world. So if you're not traveling on one of those ships that are sinking, you maybe have a chance to kind of look at a map and see the world and see how people dress and how they look. That to me is what's also fascinating about the Braun and Hogenbergs. They always have people doing something in the foreground, and you get a chance to see what it might look like there. So So I'm going to spend some time now on the city of Sevilla, which I don't think you can understate the importance of the Sevilla as a city, given its unique position during this period of Spain's, if you will, dominance. And there's a saying in Spain. It says, "Quien no ha visto a Sevilla, no ha visto maravillas." If you haven't seen Spain, you haven't seen marvel or marvelous. And Granada has another one that says, "Quien no ha visto Granada, no ha visto nada." So they kind of have like little competitive little chants. And this is to the view of Spain, of Sevilla. I'm going to go more into the next one, but again, the Casa de Contratación was the official house that controlled all commerce between Spain and the New World. All the ships that left the New World for the New World and back had to actually register, and very heavily controlled. And any information pertaining to the world was maintained at the Archivos de las Indias, which today is still a research library and holder of a number of very important documents and maps and resources, research resources. Our speaker at the New York Map Society last meeting did a presentation on indigenous maps and how they were used in property right disputes, and she spent some time at the Archivos to kind of deal with that, because these were property rights in New Spain or Mexico at the time, and they needed to kind of go back and forth between Spain to kind of adjudicate the ownership of certain parcels of land. This is the Bronnenhogenberg from 1590 of Sevilla. And, again, I love, as I said before, probably the second map I ever bought. And I just love the map because, when I spent time there working with the port, I could just imagine all these ships coming in, bringing back, either treasures and experience from the New World. They would bring it up the Guadalquivir River from the Mediterranean. And you see here a couple of things that are interesting. The Torre de Oro, the Golden Tower, truly was at a point in time used to store gold that was brought back. They would chain the river, as a lot of river port cities would, with large chains to really sort of to deter any pirates or any invasions from from the water, from sea. That was one of their major defenses, in addition to the city being a walled city. And this the muelle is the dock, or the quayside, and that's where the ships would largely be to unload their cargo and the goods. And you come across here, this Triana Bridge. It was often in the early days, it was like literally a series of like barges stitched together that people would walk across. But the Triana area of Sevilla is on this other side of the river here. It's a very popular place now, and it's always been an area with its own little culture and atmosphere. It's kind of the hip place. It always has been, probably always will be. And then you have this image here of the Inquisition prison, or they call it La Santa Inquisición, which it was where they actually carried out some of the disastrous and really heinous acts to try to get people to convert and to profess their faith in Catholicism. So bad things happening there. A little here on the corner here, you see the Corte de Colón, which is one of Columbus's homes, and he had there for a while. And I think it's also interesting, if you spend time in southern Spain, as I did in Cordova and Sevilla, this was a part of the world that had probably, in the day before the Spanish kings expelled everyone, it was one place where people from sort of Judaism, Islam, and Christianity all lived together in reasonable harmony. Cordova in particular, I would say. But you see, and everywhere you go, influence of the Moorish architecture. And this is a case that's the largest cathedral, I think, in Europe, where literally they just plunked down a large cathedral on top of what was the mosque, that was the existing mosque. So the minaret still exists as the main bell tower for the cathedral. And this kind of is a funny little thing. I just think if you read the maps of Bronnenhogenberg, and in particular this one, every little gate to the city has a door, or a name. And this one here is La Puerta de la Carne, which is the door of meat, or the meat door. And out here is La Matadera, which is the slaughterhouse. So, and I learned this morning, I was looking at something that apparently they imposed a special tax on butchers, which went to the crown to help pay for some of their wars and stuff. So I guess meat eaters ended up paying for a lot. These are just some images here of Sevilla. There's the Torre de Oro. You can see the cathedral down here with obviously it's sort of a Islamic kind of architecture. kind of melded with a kind of a Christian church, and a typical little plaza in parts of Sevilla. Again, similar, you can see the architecture, Islam architecture, and the rounded kind of cupolas and bell towers that are very unique to southern Spain. You might find similar things in northern Africa or parts of Turkey. It's kind of an interesting way to see how things go. This is a Blau map from 1688, and the point I wanted to make on this particular map is really, I've mentioned it a couple times earlier in the presentation. Madrid is so small, and I'm going to make it bigger here, compared to like this Alcalá de Henares or Complutum, or to even come down here to Sevilla, Córdoba, Valladolid, wherever I can find Valladolid. In Salamanca, obviously, was another learning place. But each of these cities, you can see they have in the key here, it's either an archbishop, it has it's academic, and it has sort of different things. So Complutum was a Roman town from the first century, and Complutum means confluence of rivers, which I believe are these two rivers here. And what I think is very interesting about it is the size of that relative to the current capital of Spain, Madrid. Well, the city had outsized importance in this day because it was the first city ever developed as a university city specifically. And it's today a UNESCO, I'll come back here, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And you can see this here. This says the University City of Alcalá de Henares was founded by Cardinal Cisneros in the beginning of the 16th century. It's the first university city that was planned in the Moor world with the model of the city of God. And this was exported by Spanish missionaries and exported to the Americas. And it's the model of the universities of Europe and other places. And so you've got Cardinal Cisneros there, set up this town with the whole thought of it being a center of learning, with a medicine school, philosophy, letters, kind of all the liberal arts. And they built this little beautiful town. And this is the birthplace of Cervantes, which if you read my article earlier, you will realize that Cervantes, the author of Don Quixote, was born there. And, so this was, kind of a very important city in the day, from, the Roman times to mid, evolution in Spain. So, for myself, who lived in Madrid, and I got to know Alcalá de Henares through a project with the Instituto Cervantes, where we were developing a strategy plan for them. So I got to go out there a number of times to their headquarters, and it was just a beautiful little place. I didn't know the story then. I really only learned about it, more recently in doing some research about the Quixote. Moving on to the next person, Tomás López was the royal cartographer to Carlos III, and he was the first one to develop a comprehensive atlas of Spain. And he did this, this work done for a number of years. And what's unique about Tomás López was he was called a studio cartographer, which meant he would actually leverage other work, other maps, or descriptions that people would send him, so he would have to compile his maps. I just put this frontispiece on here because I thought it was really interesting to show the lion with his paw on the globe, I think representing Spain's dominance of the world, and the Spanish crown and the crest. So, and then, you just the typical medallions of the king and the prince and the dedications and such. But this is the map of the country at the time of Spain. And how he compiled this was literally, he divided the country into little sectors, and he would send the priest in each town a survey and saying, please go out 17,000 meters in the circumference from your church and draw a map of your area and describe it to me in prose and send it to me. And so we'd get all these mailings and packages sent to him. He would take that along with previously published maps and try to kind of improve his map. There's been studies about the level of accuracy of his maps, and they're off a bit. They kind of look okay, but if you look at roads and areas, they're not without error, because you'd expect that because he's taking this information in from a bunch of people. So I find that to be kind of an interesting kind of way of making a map as compared to doing a survey like the British do with their ordnance surveys and their mapping of the coastline and such. This is the first map of the route of Don Quixote also published by Thomas Lopez in 1780. And he leveraged the prior map to do this. This is a portion of the map of Spain. It's the portion where Don Quixote kind of made his journeys during the novel. But what's different about this particular map is he partnered with Hermosilla, who was a royal surveyor, and he actually went out into the field. Now this is a fictional book, and they're reading the book and saying, this could be in this part of La Mancha. And he's like doing surveys and doing triangulation, trying to kind of pinpoint where they might have been in the book. So you've kind of got a combination of the studio cartographer who just sits in his office and takes in reports and reads things, with someone out there walking the land and trying to kind of do more of a topographical survey. So this combined kind of both methods of map making. I love the oh great, good, we're coming to the end anyway. So I love the this engraving here. And this actually, you see, if you've read the Quixote, or it's at the very end of his life. He's coming back to his town to die, and this is sort of very symbolic. It's an empty armor shell, if you will, no body in it, and just the remnants of his old hat and his armor. This is the last map I'm going to show, and it's a map by Herman Moll of Spain. Again, it's a beautiful map if you think about the cartouche, which shows all of the provinces, Castile, Portugal, Navarra, Toledo, and such around. But what to me about this map was very funny, and I read it, is this little advertisement down here at the bottom. And so Moll was quite a character, and in fact, he was kind of mad when he wrote this map, or made this map. So he writes this thing and says, "Among all ye cheats that ye world are daily abused with, none have lately been more scandalous than that of maps. Sometimes new ones are put out by ignorant pretenders. Sometimes mean and imperfect foreign maps are copied and published by them as their own, and having no judgment or knowledge of what is good or bad, correct or incorrect." And he goes on and on and on about maps and how he's been like sort of unjustly abused by other cartographers. So maybe a little paranoid, but also using maps as a political statement. And that is the end of my slideshow.
Thank you, Steve. That was great.
Thank you, Tom.
All right, so I'm going to open up the chat, and feel free to jump in if people have questions. I know one thing that occurred to me, Steve, when you showed the graph of the ships and the 27% that didn't make it back, was that, and I'm curious your thoughts about the Spanish and their decline and the rise of the British and the Dutch in the 17th century. And I think some people ascribe that in some ways to the rise of the Dutch East India Company and the British East India Company, and the pooling of interests of the investors in those ships, because people used to have to invest in each particular ship that went out. And so it was sort of an all or nothing affair for them if it didn't make it back.
Yeah, no, like I'm sure a number of those ships that the delta there between the ships going and coming likely were shipwrecks and or sunken ships, or pirate and privateers had gotten to them. So, and the Spaniards, actually, what's also interesting is you look at their, the prominence they had in that period of time, and they really lost it. Most of their wealth was squandered away and went to traders, Italian traders, or went to Asia. So they kept very little of their wealth. Ultimately, they had for a short time they were very wealthy, but they pretty much lost it all. Even the act of moving the capital to Madrid cost the crown a significant portion of their treasure, and they moved because before they created Madrid as the capital, the court would move around from place to place, sort of itinerant location. But they moved it from, let's say Sevilla at one point to Toledo, but to move to Madrid. I mean, Madrid is the highest capital city in all of Europe, and maybe the second. It's almost, it's not quite Denver, but it's like it's getting up there in terms of altitude. And to move from kind of like fluvial lower lands and port all that stuff up there with oxen who need to stop and chew their cud along the way, which slows that slows the traveling. and they end up spending so much money doing that it, it was a bad investment. So
Yeah, interesting.
Steve,
We've got a
Steve-
question. Hold on, Ron, just 1 second. We've got one question in the chat first from Patrick. What do you think about James Michener's writings about Spain?
I don't really know. I think when I was in college, I started to read the book Spain. I never really read the book, so I have no opinion. No opinion. Do you have one, Patrick?
Patrick?
Hey, I just, Mitchell wrote Iberia, which was kind of his travel logs about his time in Spain. And I just wanted to see like an outside perspective about that. So that's kind of why that question came up.
Yeah.
So Steve, while you were in Spain, did you also develop an interest in the Portuguese era of globalization and cartography?
Yeah, I mean, you can't help. I mean, if you're studying Spanish cartography, but you de facto have to study Portuguese, because that Spain and Portugal really divided the world in two, and studied and they were the dominant players for a while. So I did, yes. Now, unfortunately, I never really spent any time in Portugal while I was in Spain. Now, I'm spending a lot of time in Brazil now, and I have a lot of interest in going to Portugal. I think Tom and I have the idea with maybe opening a small little studio campus in Lisbon.
Yeah, just so we can go there. All right, we've got some more questions here from Christopher Tyler. I found that the coastline of Spain in the De la Costa map is strikingly accurate. What kind of survey would he have had access to for achieving this?
If you just look at Mediterranean Portland maps, they're all highly accurate. And I think it's just because that was the area of the world. When you look at ancient sort of medieval maps, Europe is very well understood because people had traveled back and forth for so long. So, and I'm sure they were using, a lot of them used earlier maps that were produced. They would leverage them. So I have a whole book of like Portland maps here from the Hispanic Society. That is, and they all have a very similar look to them. And the geography on the coastline of the Mediterranean is always pretty accurate.
And the math, their ability to do the math for those maps, do you have any ideas about the origin of that?
No, I don't know the math, about the math of it, but I just, you can see very similarity in all the Portlands.
Yeah. Eleanor
We have a
Bigelow.
question from Eleanor. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt.
I was going to get that. Thank you, Emily, for sticking up for my wife. I wasn't going to pass over that question. Do you think Catalonia will break away from Spain ever?
I don't know. I mean, they've always been threatening. So same with the País Vasco. I really can't answer where they were. I mean, they looked pretty close a couple of years ago, but I have confidence that they'll probably be hanging in there. And at some level, they broke away from Spain a long time ago and always have been. I mean, Spain is really, it continues to be, I would call it like 5 small countries, because Catalonia, the Basque Country, La Coruña up in north, northwest Spain, the Madrid and Andalusia are all very different. The people are, they have different dialects, sometimes different languages. Different foods are different. The food's great everywhere in Spain, but they're very, they're very different. But they've managed to kind of stay together as a country to date. So let's hope. I think it'd be very hard, actually, if you think about breaking off as a new country when you have. I mean, I can't imagine you've got infrastructure coming from rail lines and all these things coming in. I don't know how you would do that, but I guess it's been done before.
Fascinating discussion. I wonder if you've considered another new world, in that in 1590, Benito Arias Montanus, a Jesuit priest who was the king's editor for the Polyglot Bible, which contained 5 significant maps. And one of the maps is a map of the world according to the descendants of Noah. And this is also an interesting map because it's in Hebrew and I believe Latin. The interesting thing related to New World, why I'm saying we might call it other worlds, is that there is what appears to be an unnamed island in the position of where Australia is. And there's been a significant dispute. English experts don't want to admit that the Spanish were the first to discover this, but most students of maps pretty much agree that it probably is the first sign of Australia. And that's why I call it the other world. And you might want to consider this as a part of your collection if you don't have it, or facsimile, because I think that this would be really a significant addition and a takeoff of the New World.
No, thank you, Leonard. I will definitely look into that. That's an interesting thought.
What was the name of that map? Sorry.
Pars Orbis, Orbis.
What's the first word, Len?
Pars,
Pars, Pars.
Pars Orbis.
Pars Orbis.
Steve, I had a question about some of the recurring imagery we've seen in maps from the Age of Discovery. You pointed out the Patagonian giants and the cannibals. And I've noticed that they almost appear like stock images and that they're portrayed the same exact way on a lot of maps. The cannibals are often shown in a pair. They're leaning over some sort of table and someone's like getting his leg chopped off on that table because he's about to get eaten by cannibals. And the Patagonian giants are also often in a pair as well. And they'll have like a shorter normal person for scale standing next to them often. Same thing with the King of Spain riding over on his siege area. I'm curious what other patterns you've seen there just in the motif, since I love looking for those just personally.
So what other images you say?
Yeah.
I mean, you see like a lot of like parrots and a lot of wildlife. Like if you look at the Gutierrez map, they have on Africa, you can see a pretty interesting rhinoceros, an elephant, and another probably a lion. Then you have a lot of the same thing of wildlife in South America, parrots and monkeys and things of that nature, volcanoes blowing up. But primarily you see a lot of like native, indigenous people that were depicted either as being taller than average or having, in some cases, the Amazonian women in some maps I've seen have had like mouths in their stomach, kind of really, kind of like monstrous kind of, body morphology. So.
I was just writing here in the chat, Emily, that Chet Van Duzer has thought about and documented characters on maps and their origins. He did a great presentation on the Carta Marina where he highlights where all those images came from, their origins. I'll see if I can put something in the chat about that.
Great.
Other questions? Okay. Thank you, Steve. Thank you so very much. This
Thank you
was
for having me.
awesome. Thank you, everyone, for joining.